Hi, I'm Dustin Abbott, and I'm here today to give you my definitive review of the new Sony 14mm F1.8 G Master lens. And this truly is a master class of a lens. The last time that I did a review of a lens with this focal length and maximum aperture combination was in 2017 when I reviewed the Sigma 14mm F1.8 Art. But what a completely different reality of a lens. That lens is some 27, 28 millimeters longer. It weighs about almost 160% more than what this lens does. And the fact that Sony has managed to create a lens with this maximum aperture, this focal length, and make it pretty much hand-sized is truly impressive and makes this a lens that is really unlike anything in this class that we've seen before. It really seems like Sony is hitting their stride in terms of lens design, and the recent GM lenses have really basically all been exceptional, have been amongst the best lenses of their kind that I have ever reviewed before, period. And so I'm very, very impressed with what Sony is doing right now, and that's certainly true of this particular lens. Now today we're going to do the deep dive in the definitive review and look deep at various aspects of performance, most notably the image quality performance. But if you would prefer a shorter, more to the point review, you can check out my standard review instead. I want to start by thanking our sponsor of today's episode, a long-term sponsor at this point, which is Phantom Wallets. Today's episode is brought to you by Phantom Wallet, the minimalist, modern wallet that sets you free from a bulky traditional wallet while also making it easy to access your cards and money when you need them, thanks to their unique fanning mechanism. Visit phantomwallet.com to check out their unique sizes, styles, and finishes that span from aluminum to wood to carbon fiber. You can even customize your wallet with new accessories like a money clip, cash holder, ID display, and even the Chipolo tracking integration if you're the kind of person who loses their wallet. Use code DUSTIN15 for 15% off when you're ready to check out. So we're going to start by diving into the build and the handling, looking a little bit closer at the feature set here. Let's jump in, let's take a look. So the first thing to note about the 14mm f1.8 GM lens is it does come with a nice carrying case with a strap just to help with portability. The lens itself does have a fixed lens hood. It's pretty common for wide-angle lenses like this, and that necessitates that deeper cap that goes over the top of the lens hood, and unfortunately takes up more room for storage. And so it's not as simple to just drop it into a pocket. But that fixed lens hood does protect the protruding front element. Now the good news is that the lens does not change length at all during focus, and that front element doesn't move at all, and so at least you're working with a constant there. The 14GM has Sony's thorough weather sealing that starts with the lens gasket and has different seal points at the various rings, at the switches, and then there is a flooring coating on the front, so there's 8 internal seal points plus the flooring. One of the downside of having that fixed front lens hood is that you can't use traditional screw-in filters. Now there is a gel filter holder in place, but fortunately there also are aftermarket options like this one from Haida where you can use higher quality glass filters. It's easy to remove the original filter holder from the back of the lens and to replace it with the Haida system, which only requires removing 3 screws and then screwing them back in with the Haida system in place. And this allows you to lock in filters, glass filters that come in the kit. These filters are very compact, and so you can bring a number of them along. I've got 5 of them in the little filter kit right here, and the filters themselves are high quality glass and it'll look like this. Take the filter, you put it into place there, and then rotate the locking mechanism, and that's all it takes to get ready to go in shooting. The Haida kit I used came with 4 ND filters, starting with a 0.9 or a 3-stop, 1.2, 4-stop, 1.8, 6-stop, and 3.0 or 10-stop filters. And so that obviously gives you a lot of control over the end result in terms of exposure time. And this kit will cost somewhere between $100 and $150 US when it comes to market. The lens has Sony's variable approach to aperture, allowing you to either have clicked aperture with 1/3 stop to tense, or you can declick the aperture for a smooth racking throughout it. You can also put it into auto mode. It has Sony's focus hold button along with an AF/MF switch, and then the focus ring itself is about 2 centimeters wide, and it moves smoothly but without a lot of weight. And so I would like a little bit more damping. The focus is linear, however. The overall length of the lens is 99.8 millimeters. It is 83 millimeters in diameter and shockingly weighs only 460 grams. That is tiny compared to, say, the Sigma 14mm F1.8 that was 1170 grams and 126 millimeters long. Sony managed this despite the lens being made of nice materials, lots of metals. It feels professional grade, but as you can see, it is basically hand size, which is truly impressive. So my takeaways there is that, I mean, above all, I can't stress enough how incredible it is that they have managed to create this lens at this size. And to me, that adds so much real-world value because, frankly, I will reach for a lens like this, throw it into my bag, where I won't reach for a large lens. Like, I have some big telephotos I enjoy using, but I hardly ever reach for them because I have to be really intentional about going out for that type of photography. And I think a lens like this, you're far more likely to bring it along as a complementary focal length, even if it's not your primary, because of the size. And I think that what Sony has been doing in producing high quality lenses that are mindful of this reality is going to help them to sell more lenses, period. And so kudos to them on that. Recent trend in the focus rings is they're a little bit light for my taste, but I mean, that's really the major criticism. There are certain realities with a lens like this that are shared with all such lenses. I mean, having this kind of pinch cap, having the fixed lens hood, having to use alternative filter systems, and I get it, if you're not a fan of rear filter systems, as I've demonstrated here, I'm sure that there probably will be front filter square options in the future, but what certainly is out is any kind of traditional screw-in filter, and that's going to be true of any lens like this, any lens this wide, basically. And so, all of those things are par for the course, and so I can't really criticize them because they're not really unique to this lens. And I love the fact that Haida has already jumped into the breach and has got at least a prototype of a filter, and this is basically just a minor modification of the one that they already had in place for the 12 to 24 millimeter f2.8 lens from Sony. And so already they're on the job with that. So let's talk about autofocus for a minute. I'm recording on the lens in APS-C mode, so it's not quite such a wide angle. To give you a sense of how it tracks my face here, I'm about 1 meter away from the camera at this point, and filming on the Sony Alpha 1. So once again, Sony has employed the dual linear motors as a part of the autofocus system. And so that allows there to be very fast, accurate autofocus that has basically no sound involved. Now, I understand that with a wide-angle lens, there's a little bit less stress on the autofocus system for the simple reason that very quickly everything is in focus due to the wide angle nature of the lens itself, which has the inverse effect of having a very deep depth of field. Unless you're focused with just a few centimeters in front of the lens itself. And so very quickly everything is in focus, which means it's a little bit easier to do tracking and things like that. That being said, I have certainly used wide-angle lenses that had poor focus system, and this is certainly not one of them. Autofocus is just very, very good, and so as we can see for actually tracking movement, it does a solid job with that, and as I move in and out of distance away from the camera, it stays consistent with that and does it in a nice smooth fashion to where you don't get too caught up in major focus changes, and so that works well. Likewise, when I did my focus pull test, you will be able to hear in just a moment that environmental sounds sound really, really loud because the focus motor is just utterly silent in operation. So I think you can hear what I was talking about. You know, that iPhone notification sounded like a bomb going off because the environmental noise was so quiet, and that tells you really how quiet focus is overall. Now with a lens, again, because of the depth of field issue that I've already described, you're not going to see as much eye tracking because the eye occupies such a small portion of the frame. You may not even see face tracking in terms of the on-screen box, but what matters, of course, is whether or not results are well focused. And certainly it has been my experience that that is the case. And so whether I am on the rare occasion when I can isolate a subject, like in this shot, which is my favorite up-close shot I took with the lens, you know, or just kind of shooting in general, autofocus just locked on. It was quiet, even in dim conditions. In fact, in this shot, I did a 30-second exposure because it was twilight, and I also had put on a 10-stop ND filter. And despite that, I was actually able to achieve autofocus in this setting, which tells me that between the camera and the lens, I'm getting a really good autofocus combination. So once again, really high marks to Sony. I can't point to any lenses that are focusing better than these recent Sony GM lenses. Autofocus is just fantastic in terms of accuracy, speed, which is basically instantaneous with this lens, and of course the complete lack of sound or drama in operation. So again, what more could you ask for? So, I mean, great stuff there, and nothing to criticize. I mean, the autofocus on these recent GM lenses has been really just amongst the best of any lens that I've ever reviewed. They're just fantastic, and so I have nothing to criticize on that front. And very little to criticize even on the image quality front. I love a lens like this. A 14mm focal length allows you to do really dynamic things. You know, for example, you can really choose what to emphasize. In this shot, for example, I could choose to emphasize the foreground, and the nature of that focal length means that I can put a lot of attention and draw your attention to the ripples in the mud on the edge of the lake. But then I can tilt the camera up, and I can choose to make the sky dominate the image. And I didn't move at all between those two positions. But there's something about this wide of a focal length that is really dramatic. And I find, at least for myself, anything wider than 14 millimeters, I just find it increasingly difficult to use. So this is kind of a sweet spot for ultra wide, at least as far as my tastes go. But how does it perform, you know, individual to this lens? Let's dive in and let's take a look. So let's start by taking a look at vignette and distortion. Starting with distortion, you can see that there is some barrel distortion that is here. I will point out, however, with a really wide-angle lens like this, you have to get so close to a test chart that in some ways the very close distance does tend to exaggerate distortion a bit. This is actually a fairly mild amount of distortion for such a wide-angle focal length, and you can see it corrected fairly well. It's not perfectly linear, but it's pretty close to the correction. That's a +8 to correct for the barrel distortion. Vignette is fairly concentrated towards the corners, but moves out in a reasonable linear fashion, not too hard to correct for. I used a +55 and moved the midpoint over to 0 for this manual correction. Very soon, I'm sure that we'll see a profile for RAW files, and there's already an in-camera profile for JPEG and video files. If we look at a real-world image that you're not, right on top of, you can see that while the geometry isn't perfect, it's really quite good, and even vignette is not overly pronounced in this real-world f1.8 image, and so you can see that things are holding up quite well here overall, and not a whole lot to be concerned about. Lines are looking pretty straight, really. Now, longitudinal chromatic aberration is often not a big issue for wide-angle lenses, mostly because your depth of field in most cases is deep enough that you're not really going to see much before or after the plane of focus. You mostly just see the plane of focus. We can see that there is the mildest amount of grain fringing after the plane of focus. I didn't see any kind of real-world issue with that. Far more common, however, is lateral chromatic aberration, which will show up as both magenta and green fringing on either side of transition areas on the edges of frames, and it's irrespective of what your aperture value is. We can see very little lateral chromatic aberration here, and so that's not going to be a real-world problem for your images at all. So here's a look at my test chart, and this is on the 50 megapixel Sony Alpha 1. I will point out that once again, you're really almost too close to comfort for chart testing, and so we'll look at a real world result as well, because I'm not sure this is entirely indicative at this close. But this is at 200% magnification, and you can see that resolution is good, contrast is good. It's not perfect, however. There's still a little bit of kind of uncertainness to some of the definition of the lines. The mid-frame also looks very, very good, and we can see a great consistency because right out to the edge, it also looks quite good. As noted though, the strength of a lens like this is not, from half a meter away, but rather at the actual practical distances you're going to use it. And what we find is f1.8 on the left side and then f5.6 here on the right side. What we can see is that at the distant shoreline, they look highly similar. There's not a massive difference in terms of the resolution, even as we move off towards the edge of the frame. Contrast is excellent, at either one. And you can see that depth of field is actually quite deep, even at f1.8, in that both this foreground and the distant shoreline is in focus here, which is the nature of this particular focal length. So you can see it's a little bit improved at f5.6. You can see also that your vignette is reduced some. But truth of the matter is that it's already very, very strong at, real world 50 megapixel resolution here, even at f1.8. Another great example is this little church that I found in western Quebec. And you can see that, again, f1.8, look how crisp the detail is on the facade of the church. And the detail, I mean, you can very clearly read the, the 80-1850 there. I mean, and you can see as you go off towards the edges that detail is good moving out towards those edges as well. It's just a really strong lens, wide open. So if we do the mild stop down from f1.8 to f2, which is 1/3 stop, we don't see a tremendous amount of difference there. You can see that there is slightly more contrast, but basically it's a very similar image to what we saw at f1.8. Stopping on down to f2.8 though gives us a definite contrast improvement, and we can see off towards the edge of the frame that the delineation is a little bit better as well. Stopping on down to f4 gives us a hair more improvement and a tick more at f5.6. Now our minimum aperture here is f16, and usually the wide open result looks a lot better than the minimum result. That's not entirely true here. You can see that there's a little bit of loss of acuity, just the details are a little bit more muddled, but it's actually holding up quite well. And if I can compare down here, I would say I actually favor the minimum aperture result just a little bit more than I do the maximum aperture. And so I would still prefer to limit going to about f11, but you can see that it still holds up pretty well at f16. Now, real-world results at landscape apertures like f5.6, frankly, they're just incredible. If you look throughout this image, you can see just great detail. If we look off into the distance, one of the advantages here is that everything is in focus, and so you've got just detail wherever you look, even on a very high-resolution body, and you can see that that detail is good off to the edge of the frame. Another example here, and you've probably noticed from these images just how nice the color is as well. This is at twilight, but if we look down here into the foreground, you can just see so many texture, details on all of the stones here in the foreground. But then also, if we look towards the distance, you can see the trees on the far side of the pond. Everything looks nice and sharp and crisp, even in this lower light. I was also impressed how much detail stood up. Even this is with a 10-stop ND filter attached. And so if we look down at, these rocks, for example, you can see great detail. And of course, that great detail helps the flow of the water to look even better. And so this is a lens that holds up, even if you, limit it a bit by putting some dark optics in front of it. Our minimum focus distance here is around 25 centimeters, and that gives us a pretty low amount of magnification. It's only 0.10 times. Now, in the middle of the frame, you can see that the detail is nice and crisp. I did observe a little bit of an oddity though, as you move away from the center, you start to get this, effect that almost looks like a bit of motion blur that begins to affect the image. Obviously that's not the case. This was shot on a tripod, but it's a bit of an aberration that creates an effect like that. Now Sony talks up the quality of the background blur from this lens. The truth of the matter is that you don't buy a lens like this for the bokeh quality. It's okay, but there are very few situations where you can create that bokeh. And you start to see a phenomenon here that I noted about that blur effect, kind of almost looking like a motion blur that once again here, as we look up close, you can see that even though this was shot at 1/400th of a second, so it's not motion blur, it's just this kind of odd optical effect. Now, once again here, the circular shape looks pretty good in this frame, and so the bokeh is okay, but again, you don't buy a lens like this for the bokeh. Once again here, I actually like this image. I like the subject and the look that it's achieved, but you can see that even though it's sharp, you can see that kind of weird, almost motion blur type effect there. So best case scenario at minimum focus distance is if you put your subject near the center of the frame, whereas you can see here, everything looks very crisp, very, very nicely detailed. This is my personal favorite up-close image because it keeps the context of the forest there, which I think is really very cool. And you can see that the detail here with the composition towards the center of the frame looks fantastic. And in some ways, the kind of motion blur effect, whatever, it actually works nicely in this image. And so I really like the look of it overall. Here's another image that I really like the look of, and just the nature of it allowed me to get within the context of the greater scene where it's not completely blurred out, it's hinted at, and so I really like the feel of the image. Now, flare resistance is essentially perfect on this lens. You can see the bright sun is there. It's very directional, but there is just no ghosting artifacts here to be seen. Once again, here, a very low sun, and it's being reflected off the water. There's just no ghosting to be found anywhere. There's no veiling. It's just fantastic pointed at the sun. And if you stop down, here is the biggest ghosting blob I could get with the bright sun right there. There's a little bit of an effect here, but you can also see how really, really nice the sunburst effect is. And if you position that, like here up in the trees, it provides a really fantastic look. And so flare resistance, definite strength for this lens. So once again, Sony is really just nailing it when it comes to lens design. This is a lens that basically checks all of the boxes, and the one thing I do apologize for is that I wasn't able to personally test coma, and most of it is because, as you might have been able to tell in this review, I'm getting rained on, and every day this has happened during the 2 weeks that I've had the lens. Every evening, clouds roll in, and I just don't see the sky, and so I wasn't able to test Astro. However, I was in on a Sony briefing before this lens was announced, and they demonstrated Astro. It looks like it performs very well. And after all the other things that you have seen as a part of this lens performance, would you really be surprised by that? So, I mean, they've kind of hit all of the high notes here. It's produces wonderfully dynamic lenses, great color, great detail. I love the lens. I'm very tempted by it myself. At the end of the day, the final hurdle to clear for any potential buyer is, of course, the price. Now, in an absolute sense, this lens is expensive. It is nearly $1,700 US, which is expensive no matter how you slice it. And certainly there are cheaper alternatives, though not f1.8 alternatives. The only other alternative at f1.8 and 14mm is the Sigma that I mentioned at the beginning, and it's actually priced $1 more than this lens. And so you're not making any savings there. And I'm also reminded of the fact that if you look back to the DSLR generation, the Canon 14mm f2.8L Mark II is still priced at $2,100 US, despite the fact that it was introduced in 2007. The Nikon equivalent 14mm f2.8 is not much better off at around $1,800 or $1,900. And so those are for lenses with a maximum aperture of f2.8 and now well more than a decade old optical design. So relative to professional grade competition, this lens is actually priced reasonably, even though it's still expensive in an absolute sense. And so if you want this kind of focal length and you've got the money to buy it, go for it. It really is a fantastic lens. I'm Dustin Abbott. If you look in the description down below, you can find linkage to my full text review. Also linkage to an image gallery. I recommend taking a look at photos. 14mm photos are fun, so go check that out. There's also buying links there if you'd like to purchase one for yourself. Also linkage to follow me on social media to buy some of my merch. Lots of great options there. And of course, if you haven't already, please click that subscribe button right here on YouTube. Thanks for watching. Have a great day and let the light in.